Good morning. My name is Dallas Smith. I'm the acting chief counselor of the Tlowitsis Nation and spokesperson for the Coalition of First Nations for Finfish Stewardship. We're here today on Anishinaabe-Algonquin territories as rights holder First Nations to call on the federal government to avoid further social and economic costs of closing BC salmon farming in our traditional territories without our consent. We've been consulting on this transition plan for 3 years almost. We're completely dissatisfied with the federal government's imposed transition plan for salmon farms within our traditional territories. To date, this process has been flawed, unpredictable, and what is looking more and more like a predetermined political outcome. The government is not meeting its consultation obligations of the Crown. We're tired of the federal government talking to us about the decisions they're making in our territories. They're listening to activists and ministers like Jonathan Wilkinson who are continuing to interfere with our rights and self-determination. There's a difference between activists and conservationists. First Nations have rights and title, and they work with conservation communities to protect valuable lands and resources within our territories. Activists simply point out problems that exist. Coastal right holder First Nations versus stakeholders is a very important difference in this discussion. The Union of British Columbia Indian Chiefs and other First Nations are trying to impose their will in places that aren't their territories. We've seen this happen in Fairy Creek, and we've seen this happen with the TMX pipeline. This imposed transition plan is not only irresponsible and dismissive to our rights and title, it's expensive. The new Stats Canada report released this week shows that BC salmon farming production dropped 41% in 2023, while the cost of salmon nearly rose 10% for all of Canadians. And the cost of this irresponsible plan keeps rising. Today, we're announcing a new economic report from the BC salmon farmers that will cost the taxpayers an extra $9 billion. $9 billion to mitigate the damages to Indigenous communities, coastal communities, and the salmon farming sector. Also on the line is the cost of losing rights and title in BC to First Nations. This is a dangerous precedent. On top of costing the $9 billion, there will be less food on the table as the cost of salmon goes up. And with the recently announced Trump tariffs that are coming, food affordability is just going to become harder and harder for everyday Canadians. To speak to this more, I'd like to introduce David Kiemele, Manager Director of Cermaq Canada, to speak to the launch of the BC Salmon Farmers' newest economic report. David.
Thank you, Dallas, and good morning, everybody. My name is Dave. I am a salmon farmer. It is my privilege to stand here today representing thousands of proud Canadian farmers, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, their families, small communities that rely on salmon farming for their jobs, their livelihoods, and their futures. Every person involved in our sector has been directly and will be indirectly and directly impacted by this current policy decision if there is no change. Today, as Dallas mentioned, the BC Salmon Farmers Association released a new economic impact report. The cost of a politically driven, unrealistic ban, if implemented, will sadly mean replacing a sustainable industry with a $9 billion burden to Canadian taxpayers, a loss of $1.17 billion in annual economic activity from the Canadian economy, the end of over 4,500 well-paying full-time jobs. That is a payroll of $259 million, and the elimination of $437 million in annual spending with over 1,400 vendors in British Columbia alone. If this federal government thinks that we would prefer a $9 billion compensation package versus well-paying jobs, healthy rural communities, and the privilege of putting wholesome Canadian salmon on people's plates, they are so wrong. I want to be very clear. If these jobs are lost, they are not coming back. These impacts will be generational. In British Columbia, where I live and work, 100% of the salmon farmed today are grown under agreements between farmers and nations. The partnership between our company, Cermaq Canada, and the Xai'xais First Nation is over 20 years long and has created multiple long-term positive social and economic benefits. Our partnership with the Xai'xais, first and foremost, is built on a foundation of respecting and protecting wild salmon. Under the nation's governance and strict environmental standards, but based on federal recent decisions, our partnership with the Xai'xais Nation that has a value over a 30-year generational cycle of $543 million to the Xai'xais Nation is now completely at risk of disappearing. This simply cannot happen. This is only one example of the many partnerships that can be found in the salmon farming industry in British Columbia today. This is all happening at a time when everyday Canadians are worried about Canada's cost of living, the cost of food, and the Canadian economy. This misguided policy will result in a $435 million loss to Canada's GDP and the elimination of a $1.1 billion industry. I'd like to say that again. The loss of a $1.1 billion industry, a food industry, a farming industry that provides well-paying jobs in rural, coastal, and Indigenous communities. Let that sink in. Can Canada really afford these kinds of losses, especially now? I ask. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Isaiah Robinson. I'm the Deputy Chief Counselor of the Kitasoo Xai'xais Nation, located on the central coast of British Columbia. You know, it's overall we've been doing this for, like Dallas has said, for 3 years, and we are getting tired at this point. I'm getting tired. It takes 24 hours to get here on a good day, and I'm tired of, at this point, repeating the same points to new politicians on the so-called aquaculture transition plan that has bounced between groups to groups. But mostly I'm tired of the pseudo-consultation, which proves only to exclude Indigenous communities along the coast while determining the fate of this overall industry. Enough is enough. This is history repeating itself, but this time Indigenous people, our people, are here to tell you how this will end. Salmon farming isn't just about jobs in my nation. It is the backbone of First Nations communities up and down the coast of British Columbia. In the Kitasoo Xai'xais territory, this employs 51% of the overall people within my community. Mothers, fathers, elders, who rely on this industry. Salmon farming isn't replaceable, not in my community, not in my colleagues' communities. It provides food security, year-round employment, and pride to our people. Since farming has came to my territory over 25 years ago, we haven't struggled in the sense of dealing with social impacts like suicides in the last 18 years. That is not a statistic. It's a sign of what this industry has done for our community and others like us. Without salmon farming, our coastal communities will face generational trauma. Parents will lose their jobs. The youth will leave their territories because there is no opportunities to stay. Families will lose their pride and hope for their future. These are inevitable, yet entirely avoidable. The costs of this overall industry, the cost of this economic report can capture that. This report that we're launching showcases a $9 billion hit to Canadians if this industry is banned. But what it doesn't show is the social cost of our First Nations losing aquaculture within our communities. Because how can we put a price tag on suicides, addictions, overdoses, domestic violence, and an increased strain of our already overwhelmed rural health care system? How do you compensate a mother losing her son to suicide? How do you answer children who are growing up watching their communities crumble under poverty? These are real, unmeasurable costs that will ripple across our nations and they'll be impacted by this transition. And we already are fighting to keep these communities afloat. This ban will sink us. It will sink the North Island. This isn't about economics. It's about generational opportunities for all First Nations with salmon farms in our territories. Salmon aquaculture is the youngest industry in the overall agricultural sector. It offers hope and opportunity for our youth. While I still have hope, I can see hope fading in others, but I hold on because I do not want to manage poverty in my nation. Let me ask you this. Why is it that industry is being cut off by the knees? Other industries like forestry, oil and gas are given time to innovate and pivot. They're given a second, third, and fourth chance to improve their practices and innovate as an industry. Yet we are being told an overhaul of an entire industry within just 5 years must be done. It is an impossible task. 5 years to grow and innovate? That's not only possible, but is outlined in our overall transition plan the Kitasoo Xai'xais Nation has developed and other nations have developed over the last 2 years too. This plan combines our traditional knowledges and modern science. It is a roadmap for sustainable salmon aquaculture that works within our territories. It took 2 years to draft, and over the last year it's been sent to inboxes, brought to meetings, and we're still being asked by the government, what is our next step? So I'll ask you, have you read our transition plan yet? The truth is, our solutions are not being taken seriously. So if not here, with this plan, where is the solution? Well, there is not a disproportionate number of philanthropists that are in Jonathan Wilkinson's corner. They're not an independent monitoring oversight by the UBCIC or Bob Chamberlain. People who are anti-salmon farming do not run salmon farms in our territories and are actively impeding on the sovereignty of dozens of First Nations across the BC coast. The solution here is in the 20 years we have spent building this industry to what it is today. In the upcoming years, we have to push for this industry to grow and be responsible with a path to work with First Nations and that doesn't destroy the coastal communities that depend on this overall industry. It is ridiculous that our communities have to pay the price for the government's activist-driven decisions and poor consultation process. We're being forced off a path of prosperity and into a path of poverty, while millionaires line their pockets and politicians like Jonathan Wilkinson further their political agendas. This government claims to support reconciliation. So where is the support now? Coastal nations like mine have proven we can balance with growth and protection. The Kitasoo Xai'xais Nation has signed a Great Bear Rainforest Agreement over the last 20 years, and we've recently signed one this year. In total, we've protected 52% of our territory while creating economic opportunities for our people. You trust us to protect our land and our waters, so why do you not trust us to do what we're doing right now? We are balancing economic prosperity and environmental conservation. Can the activists say that? To be clear, when the activists get their way, the wild stock won't meticulously return. What will return is poverty, and addiction, and despair within my community. If our salmon pens are removed, the only impact will be the hopelessness left behind in our community. This isn't about salmon farms. This is about self-determination, our rights and our title. It is about people. And we are done playing this game. We are not chess pieces, and neither are the people in our community. I won't let people be pushed back into poverty because of privileged politics. Not this time. Thank you.
Thank you, Isaiah. Been in this process for 2 years, trying to build a realistic and responsible transition plan as was set out 2 Department of Fisheries and Oceans ministers ago. Our time of waiting for government to meet our needs is done. Through our experiences learned in land use planning processes like the Great Bear Rainforest, where we protected 70% of coastal British Columbia's temperate rainforests, protecting salmon habitat and other things, we're trying to find that balance for economic opportunity that's so important. So today we are announcing that our process will be the future. Today we are announcing what our process will be for the future of salmon farming within our territories. We will be launching a government-to-government-to-government discussion that invites both levels of government. We need to work with both the federal government and the provincial government who share jurisdiction over our territories where we have complete jurisdiction. We'll have a technical table with experts that will help ensure the right technology is installed in our territories. We'll bring in the conservation sector, the aquaculture workforce, local communities, and other affected stakeholder groups. Of course, our nations will be overseeing the monitoring of the transition of farming in our territories as we have for the last 10 years. Using our Guardian Watchman, traditional knowledge, and the Indigenous Center for Aquatic Health Science as a tool to help us maintain the high level of standards that's expected from Canada in the world today. Our plan for salmon farming in our territories will allow a realistic amount of time for a transition responsibly to encourage business certainty and opportunity for our nations and certainty for our partners. We will ensure that the transition plan will respect the territory's uniqueness and each nation's autonomy. We will continue to ensure that coastal communities and food security grows, and rather than cost the Canadian taxpayers $9 billion, we will continue to grow upon the $1.2 billion sector as it's trying to continue forward in our lands and waters. First Nations across Canada are finding their feet in regards to managing their territories in a way that protects their lands and waters and encourages economic prosperity for their communities. Our transition plan for salmon farming in our territories is proof that there is a way to balance economic viability, ecological integrity, but most important, human and community well-being. We welcome the Government of Canada and the British Columbia government to join our process. Now we'll take any questions. Xai'xais Nation.
Nous allons maintenant prendre les questions en ligne. Si vous avez une question, s'il vous plaît, utilisez la fonction main levée. Stuart, please go ahead.
Hi there, Stuart Benz for the Hill Times. Dallas, I just wanted to get clarification on that last bit you said there. Is this for a new process on the transition, sort of, I guess, instead of the one that's been proposed by the federal government, just to get clarity on that one?
Yes, we participated in the various versions of transition that have been undertaken by the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, and we feel it hasn't adequately addressed the needs of our communities. We've all developed transition plans from the 17 communities that have agreements with companies within their territories, and each time we get closer to a decision point, we've just been politically sideswiped on this. And so we've decided that we're going to invite both levels of government to a new process that's going to be tripartite and continue continue to go forward to build that realistic and responsible plan.
And just sort of, I know there's been a lot of sort of, I guess, not the greatest sort of back and forth relationship with the Department of Fisheries. The new sort of transition is now being led by ISED, so Innovation and Science and Economic Development. But I noticed that there was that reception earlier today. This was aquaculture as agriculture. Is that sort of a sign that you guys think that this should be handled by different a different department, or is this more of this needs to be handled by more departments sort of thing?
I think it's a little bit of both. I think the relationship we've developed with the Department of Fisheries and Oceans at a technical and bureaucratic level is as strong as it's ever been, really, in my history. But unfortunately, it's when it gets to the minister's office that we've had the challenges that we've faced. But the other reason for bringing in ISED and the other ministries is the impacts go so far beyond the Department of Fisheries and Oceans that we needed the government of Canada to realize it takes a whole of government approach to deal with the significance of reconciliation as it pertains to resource development within our territories.
Thank you. This concludes the press conference. Merci. C'est ce qui conclut la conférence de presse.
Kitasoo.